I'd like to start SPF China Observer Public Forum. Thank you very much for joining us for SPS China Observer Public Forum organized by Sasakawa Peace Foundation. The theme of the session today is highly topical. That is the Peng Shuai case, political and social trends in China as reflected in Peng Shuai case. The case itself, Peng Shuai case, not only her case, but also we would like to look into political situation in China, which lies behind the case, and what kind of social trends exist behind this case. Looking at these issues, we would like to try to understand the current situation in China. We have a speaker from University of Tokyo, Professor Ako Tomoko. As discussant, we have Professor Takahara Akio, the advisor to SPF China Observer. Professor Takahara is also with the University of Tokyo. Today, Professor Ako is going to make a presentation with her thoughts. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Ako.
Hello, nice to see you. I am Ako Tomoko, nice to be here. Today, I would like to talk about the incident of a tennis player, Ms. Peng Shuai, which has drawn the attention of the many. I specialize in sociology with regard to this issue. Of course, one can analyze this incident from the power struggle aspect, but I would like to focus on the relationship with the social movement as well as Xi Jinping's stance on the social movement. Well, Ms. Peng Shuai was a champion at Wimbledon. She's a very famous tennis player. The former Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli, she said that forced upon himself on her, and she reported about that on her SNS. She didn't intend to create the social movement herself, but there was a Me Too movement touching upon the sexual violence and the assault. Worldwide, Me Too movement has been rolled out, and in China as well. There was a time when this had grown to be a big topic, and Chinese authorities are afraid of an element that may link to the social movement. In my report, I would like to talk about the 2018 Me Too movement, which was a big movement in China. And based on that, I would like to have an analysis on the issue. With regard to sexual harassment cases, there is a lady lawyer in charge of the litigation and online. I heard her view, and I'd like to share with you what I learned from her. And lastly, I would like to talk about the outlook for Xi Jinping leadership and the government. Domestic economy is in stagnation worldwide. Uncertainty is rising. That is the background. So Xi Jinping government is said to be going into the third term, but his foundation is not that solid. And information manipulation and misinformation campaign is going on because of that, and I would like to touch upon that later. So, Ms. Peng Shuai, she's a women tennis player from China. When is Peng Shuai hashtag? Where is Peng Shuai? So this is incident occurred in China, but it has become a worldwide incident. What happens in China? Of course, initially she came up with a post on SNS, and it stayed on the screen for just half an hour, and it was taken down. But name Zhang Gaoli appeared. It's usually the case that immediately such a famous name comes up on the screen, it will be taken down immediately, but it was left on the screen for half an hour. People question that. We don't know the reason why. But anyway, the fact that we know now is that domestically, confession made by Ms. Peng Shuai has not been going around that much, but it had created much fuss in the rest of the countries in the world, and the Beijing Olympic is coming up in February, and IOC chair, Mr. Bach, made a comment. He said that he had a video conferencing with Ms. Peng twice, was able to assure the safety of her. In the second telephone conversation he had, Mr. Bach said that he seemed to be a little bit more uncertain, so cause need to be found out. What about WTA? WTA's reaction has been that because of this situation, the safety of Ms. Peng has not been assured and confirmed. So WTA suspended all the tournament which was planned to be held in China. So IOC places more emphasis on the businesses, but WTA emphasis more on the human rights. This is a contrast made between the two organizations for criticism. Well, internationally, on the part of the United States, the U.S. House unanimously adopted a resolution accusing IOC. And also, German Sports Association issued a statement against IOC, saying that they place more emphasis on the political economic interest rather than protecting athletes. And US, Australia, UK, Canada, Lithuania announced a diplomatic boycott for the Beijing Olympic. And the Foreign Minister Wang Yi consulted with foreign ministers of Iran, Hungary, Switzerland, and later Chinese Foreign Ministry said that they oppose to the politicization of sports and opposed to ideology and political issue blocking sports. France and Germany hasn't decided yet on what to do about the boycott. So is Japan. Japan is set to make a decision by the end of this year, but who would go to the Olympics as a diplomatic corps from Japan is not decided yet. So right now, Ms. Peng Shuai has become a point of attention, but in China, there are so many people who went missing in China, like lawyers and activists, journalists, many more. And there are people who are involved. The left-hand side, second one, the photo, Mr. Tokitsuden, human rights lawyer. His daughter is falling ill in Japan, hospitalized, and the bacteria germs went into her brain because of the pneumonia and kept unconscious for 7 months or so. And he wanted to meet her daughter very much in Japan. Requested for the exit out from China, but it has not been accepted yet. And of course, every December there is an event honoring human rights events. An EU event he was intending to attend, but on the way he went missing. And to this day, his whereabouts is not known. And also, for the human rights, there are so many problems involving China. Like there is a lady lawyer. She's not missing, but she was convicted in Wuhan when the pandemic was at its peak. As a citizen, she wanted to tell the truth, and over social media, she posted many articles. Since then, she has been indicted on the charge of incitement, and a mock trial was conducted, and imprisonment sentence was given. She is having a hunger strike. Her weight is less than 40 kilograms, but has not been able to be hospitalized. And the UN organizations and other international organizations are protesting about her fate. So against that background, in China, there are two Me Too movement, which I would like to focus on today. For women to raise voices. Of course, China is a socialist country. They are supposed to make much about what women say, but in 2015, 5 women activists who planned anti-sexual harassment demonstration in public transport on World Women's Day were detained, disregarding the warnings. And at that time, he had created an international fuss, big voices, and 1 month later, these women were all released. And those activists now are in Europe or in the United States and continuing with activities, some of them. But at that time, it had drawn the attention of the many, and since sexual harassment case to be brought to the court is very rare in China. But in 2018, the CCTV, Mr. Zhu Zhen, who is a famous anchor, were accused by a victim. This incident occurred in 2014. It is usually the case that it doesn't go to immediately to the court. The victim tends to stay patient, but cannot stand any longer. So 4 years after, in 2018, the victim accused the assailant on the SNS under the name of Bashan Zi. Her real name is Zhao Shaoshuan, and she made a post on the Weibo and made an accusation. And the trial continued, but in September this year, because of the evidence being insufficient, her case was dismissed. And at that time, the police, of course, Mr. Zhu Zhen is a very famous anchor, household name. So to accuse him means that he was a national example of positive energy in state campaign to promote good behavior, and his reputation cannot be tainted. That was what the BBC reported, saying that these are the words said by the police, said to Ms. Zhao. And also, in Beihang University case, there was another case involving Professor Chen Xiaowa. Accusation took place in 2018, but actually the incident occurred 12 years ago when the incident had occurred and the post was made on the website of China. Professor Chen was accused, and he was said that at least Professor Chen sexually harassed 7 women, 7 female students, and got one of them pregnant. At that time, university, because the accusation was made, conducted investigation, and Chen was removed from vice president of a graduate school, and his teaching credentials are revoked. And there were many other similar cases, like the case of UIBE, University of International Business and Economics, and Beijing University's Professor Shen Yang. When he was working for Beijing University, later he went to Nanjing University. He caused incidents, and at that time, Beijing University, as well as Nanjing University, had set a dedicated working group to make an investigation into this ends. And anti-sexual harassment stipulation was set or examined to be set at the Beijing University, and it went around to other universities, and students had posted many of their voices externally, and similar actions have been made by the university. Now, last one is a suicide case of Ms. Lee. It took place in 2018. She was 19 at that time. And the girl student jumped from the building to her death. When she was a high school student, her teacher sexually harassed her. And the high school wanted to resolve the case by paying the money, but parents instead sued the case. But then the teacher were just being given administrative detention and continued just teaching in the same school, nevertheless. And the girl became depressed and made a suicide attempt 4 times, and eventually she committed suicide and died. Later on, initially it was the case where the indictment has been dropped, but prosecution made a litigation and it was taken back, and April 2020, imprisonment of 2 years have been given as a sentence. So I've been talking about gender-related litigations. There are many of them, but it's very difficult to bring that case to the trial. That is a fact. And in 2016, anti-DV law came into force. And also provincial regulation accordingly were made on the DV. Progress has been made. Sexual crimes laws have rape and sexual assault offenses, and in case of human trafficking, rape can be an offense with additional penalty. As for the sexual harassment in 2017, for the very first time, the court admitted the civil case to be brought. Motives have been the cause of a civil lawsuit established by Supreme People's Court, which had added the charge of sexual harassment to the collection of causes. And the provision sets the form for court document. And this is something like a clerical guide for judges. But by allowing sexual harassment to be put into the official document of a court, it opened up the door for victims to take civil case for remedy. And in 2021, Civil Code Article 1010 was enforced. Damages for sexual harassment prevention by companies and schools and mandatory investigation were set. Provisions on sexual harassment used to be before that scattered across laws like labor law. It was not being unified. But in civil code, now the provision have been created, which is a very big thing, big progress, but concrete interpretation and case will be accumulated from now on. So reform was made possible by SNS. Its influence is great. Particularly after Me Too movement, although the DB anti-law was established, so the awareness that sexual violence is a crime spread around in the society, but there are remaining problems. Like threatening is a requirement for establishing the rape case. At the court, whether victim registered or not is a debatable point. But it's difficult for the plaintiff to prove that they had registered. Presence or absence of consent should be the requirement to establish the case, but it remains to be ambiguous to this day. And men cannot be subject of rape. Even raped, only sexual assault will apply. And also from protecting the minors, of course, the 14-year-old for the consensual age is said to be too low. And there are lawyers working on defense to a certain number. But it's very difficult to establish a case and prove the case. And there is a second rape, which is talked about. Even if you win the case, later on, it will be a follow-on difficulty because within the family members cannot accept the incident. And teachers raped his students and convicted, but a family member would accuse their daughter of having lost her virginity and brings a bad omen. Of course, reporters will not give identity of the individual, but if the real name is reported, then it's rather easy to track down who that is in a depopulated area. So much more than the incident per se, second rape might inflict a bigger damage. So gender education is very important. And also there are cases where rights of victims are not protected because even if the damage is given, family members would use that money arbitrarily. And it will be a big burden on the direct victim to file a case once again to the civil court. Assailant will go to jail, and they think that they had done enough, so may not pay damage. There is a relief system for the victim of a crime, but the review criteria is so stringent. Money given is very small, 20,000 to 30,000 yuan, which is small, but people say that's too high. And a negative impact might be given to the direct party by legal process, because sometimes mental illnesses will be inflicted on the victim. In case of DV case, the convicted husband killed his wife and committed suicide. So even if defeated, there are victims who don't think that's meaningful. And I have collected information from the women lawyer that I know. She had a very difficult life herself as well. In university, she learned human rights law, and as a lawyer, he has been involved in 7 or 9 cases, and about 1,300 lawyers have been cracked down, and she was one of them. And in 2017 to 2019, during which time her lawyer license was suspended, but now her qualification have been revived, and she's working as a lawyer after 2019. So let me go on to my summary. So in relation to Ms. Peng Shuai's incident, I looked at the Me Too movement and the social movement. In her incident, Ms. Peng Shuai, domestically, the report has been suppressed. But in overseas, China authority is saying, the third person is saying that she is safe. But there is a CGTN, external media, China Global TV Network, which is making lots of news. Just the other day, in the United States, the Summit for Democracies has been held, and CGTN is criticizing the Western forces. In 2018, they came up with this kind of reporting, saying that there is a Me Too movement occurring in the whole country. The university professors' problem have been reported quite well. But Ms. Peng Shuai's incident is not reported well. Okay, she's safe. And Mr. Zhang Guolin's name does not appear again. As for the truth, what had happened, no verification is taking place. That being the case, I would say that there might be information manipulation, just selecting good information and discarding the wrong information or bad information, inclusive of Western democracies, inclusive of Japan. There are many problems, I know, but despite that, the China, of course, tends to play up those parts and criticize. So society is becoming much more uncertain. Disinformation, information manipulation will be put to the fore by Chinese authority. So China model versus a democratic model found in the West, and try to emphasize the predominance and the superiority of a Chinese system. I think that is what authorities are up to in China. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ako. China, within China, Me Too movement is representative case. That is a case of social movement, and human rights activists and lawyers who are supporting Me Too movement, other social trends have been explained, and also how the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party are responding to such a case. That is information, disinformation, misinformation campaign is expected to increase going forward. Given this situation, there was a summit for democracy recently, and China's democracy was announced, and also the foreign ministry is also has issued the America's democracy document. The American democracy fell into money politics Therefore, there is no justice, and also there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor. There is a bipolarization in the United States, according to that statement. However, next year, China is going to have a 20th Chinese Communist Party. So this is very politically highly sensitive period. Professor Takahara, given the current political situation, including Peng Shuai case in China, toward such social movement, how Chinese leaders are going to respond and how effective their response would be. From that perspective, could you explain your views? Before that, those who are listening to this program, we are accepting questions from you. So anytime, please use the chat function to post your questions.
Thank you. I was listening to the presentation. I just remember that during the spring, this time in Alaska, Blinken, Sullivan, and Yao Jiechi and Wang Yi had met and had a meeting. At that time, Mr. Yao Jiechi said that U.S. democracy has lots of bad points. And Blinken said that, of course, there are problems, but we acknowledge that. That's what Mr. Blinken has said, and I just remember that. So in one word, if you look at the China CCP, within China, they don't tend to acknowledge what's happening as facts. That is a source of a big problem. So within Chinese society, in terms of status of women there in business world, there are many business women who are being very active. That's what many people know. And during the Mao days, the heaven is supported by the same number of men and women. However, with regard to politics, or if you look at the entire mood prevalent on the society, there is a paternalistic mentality remaining in the system of politics and society. For example, there is a central committee member, 204 members. How many women are there in that committee? 10. And for the Politburo member, 25, out of which how many women are there, do you know? Only 1. And looking at the past cases, so far, CCP, when they came into power, ever since in the Politburo, the executive members, no women had gotten the membership on that. Of course, anti-corruption campaign is going on strongly in China. There is a scandal being revealed involving top leadership. Then, those revealed figure, many of them are men and have been involved in women matters and affairs. That is likely to be the case to be uncovered. But it cannot be condoned. That's why worldwide the Me Too movement had gotten much more active. And at one time, China also done something similar to Me Too movement and also became vocal about improving the status of women in China. From time to time, such a social movement grew in China, but every time it was crushed. For women to claim her rights, it's not a common thing to do. That person will be regarded as a maverick. Of course, CCP is not trying to advocate that. So CCP will not listen to what the society will say, like women affairs or the divulging the asset held by top leadership and so forth. Every time these come to the fore, they are being crushed by the authority. I told you about the conversation between Blinken and Yao Jiechi, that CCP is still not so confident about themselves. So that's why they cannot admit to their problems, and they cannot vocally admit the problem and try to correct that. Xi Jinping makes remarks, but there is a contradiction involved here. In 2017, previous party congress was held, the 19th Congress. And he talked about the major contradiction of China. There is a beautiful life desired by people. The beautiful life by people. Beautiful life wanted by people. There is existence of such on one hand, but on the other hand, the development level and the balance of the development which satisfies that desire has not been put into place yet. That is a contradiction of China. So how can ladies' women's rights can be fulfilled? Isn't equivalent to wanting to have a beautiful life. People have a innocent desire to have that kind of life. But Chinese authorities are not looking into the issue squarely. Of course, we cannot boast ourselves because be it the American society or Japanese society, every society have a similar issue about corruption as well. We always say how much China has a corruption problem, but we do have some aspect of corruption everywhere. Apart from China as well, that is correct. But right now, China has developed so much, it's a great power. How China would behave will give a big influence over the rest of the world. That is the situation. That is the presence of China. And everyone admits China to be a country with influence, which means that China has a responsibility to fulfill, heavy responsibility at that. But looking at the current state of system of China, I would say that the current situation is likely to continue for some time to come. That is an external observation that I can give. And all the decent people within China are saying that this is a time to be patient. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Professor Takahara just said, what the government is trying to do, if the people want to do something different, they are regarded as heretical or dissident. Listening to that explanation, I thought also Professor Ako said, Summit for Democracy, which took place for 2 days from the 9th of December, just in accordance with that, China issued a white paper on China's democracy, and the people-based democracy is explained in that document. Now, people-based democracy, according to the explanation, is that there is an integration in the uniformity between the people's wish and the government's wish, which means that Chinese people have to act in accordance with the wish and intention of the Chinese authorities, Chinese Communist Party. That is what the document wants to say, according to my explanation, interpretation. So I would like to ask questions to two speakers. To Professor Ako, in your report, there are several points related to sexual harassment and sexual assaults. You explained several court cases. In that, there are some cases where the defendant were found guilty or not. So now, when it comes to sexual harassment case, sexual assault case, the victims in the Chinese court cases, victims have to prove that the defendant is guilty. How difficult is it to substantiate their case? And I would like to know why that is so difficult in China. After that, Professor Takahara, I have a question to you. Regarding Summit for Democracy, China's reaction to the summit, could you elaborate on that? And also I want to ask Professor Ako to intervene as well. The Summit for Democracy, I thought that was the US sort of own goal. So invite the countries and countries which are not invited, I think the US drew a line between the two groups of countries by inviting some and not inviting others. So the Chinese news agency had a caricature depicting Harry Potter and saying that this is the West democracy. And also CCTN, as Professor Ako explained, there is a reality check program and a news program which was broadcast in the US picked up like violence scenes or the very aggressive police acts and also COVID-19 cases, which are quite convenient for China, picked up and collected to show to Chinese people that this is the US democracy. However, we cannot produce such a program in China, in Japan and the US to depict China's situation because we don't get data from China because there is information control. Therefore, we can't get information or data coming from China, which is not convenient to China. Therefore, as Professor Takahara said, in democratic countries, we are able to have information so that we can assess what government is doing. However, that is not the case in China. Now, when it comes to information, even though Chinese government wants to control information, however, there is a possibility that people still are exposed to information overseas. Therefore, such an attempt can be criticized as well. In China as well, there are people in China who know the situation in the West. And information they get in China does not represent the truth of what's happening in the West. Some people know that in China. Professor Ako first.
Thank you. About the sexual assault case and the sexual harassment case related litigation. To start with, to go to the trial itself is a very rare case. Within a university campus, there is an instructor and the female students or subordinates and the bosses, the relation of hierarchy. There is an interest involved, so it's very hard to divulge the case. And the typical case is a tennis player, Ms. Peng Shuai, but I cannot stand any longer. That's why sometimes a confession is posted on the SNS. In case of China, to keep the stability is a norm so that Chinese authority doesn't like to have a court case created first. That's why they wanted to contain the case before it gets bigger. That's why conviction is given, or university will make a investigation team and make a relevant rules and so forth. It was back in 2018. But ever since the early part of 2000, different kinds of social movement had started to take place within China. And if you compare then and now, the surveillance technology have become much more advanced. So even there is a nascent movement, it will be crushed immediately before it gets bigger. So one would like to file a case, but cannot. SNS is spotted and censored and taken down immediately. So people on the weak side, their voices cannot be heard or cannot raise their voices. And also with regard to sexual harassment, the evidence is very important, but it's very hard to submit the evidence because this incident had taken place within a closed door. It's hard to prove what had happened inside that room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The surveillance technology that you mentioned, there is one more point. Let me continue to ask you a question, Professor Ako. Surveillance technology, it is used to monitor victim side. However, the technology is not used to prevent the crimes.
lately, the kidnapping case of children have drawn the attention due to the remarkable progress of surveillance technology. In the thousands, the criminal and perpetrator have been found. Kidnapped children were discovered and DNA investigation was made, and that child was able to meet with his or her real parents. Maybe it turned out fine, but there was a case that thousands of children have been kidnapped, which is a striking case. Of course, China has a big population, but the kidnapping case became very serious. Maybe it's only a tip of an iceberg, but with regard to the crimes, surveillance technology is being applied, of course.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Takahara, please.
Thank you. With regard to the Summit for Democracies, as it was pointed out, as viewed from externally, I have to wonder for what purpose, for what effect that meeting have been held. It's hard to be convinced about the holding of the summit itself. It is true that as viewed by everyone, for all intents and purposes, if you look at US political situation, maybe they are at a pinch in terms of the democracy. Because in the previous presidential campaign, there are many Republicans who seriously believe that the election have been rigged. Looking at that situation, I cannot but wonder what is the real situation of the United States, what has come over US. And at the same time, there is an issue of information involved here. In China, there is an information control going on, which is creating lots of problems. Look at the Hong Kong issue. In what way they are reported, depending on that, the receiver of news reacts very differently. It's hard to imagine. So what about United States, which is free from information control? No information-related problem? It's not so. There are certain problems, because if you believe in one thing too hard, then you might get biased. And you just get access to the news that you like to hear. There are CNN watchers and Fox watchers. There are strikingly difference here. They each have a totally different sets of awareness. One watching CNN and another watching Fox, so that media literacy is very important. In what way we should get access to the information is a very important topic. Regardless of it being a democracy or not, we have to always remind ourselves about how to access information. On global basis, we need to always seriously think about this. So concretely, it's a philosophy, way of thinking, but how can we concretely represent that in our behavior? Under the situation, still we are under pandemic, we cannot meet directly Chinese people. Situation is very difficult. Through SNS and the online, we can converse with a Chinese counterpart, but what should we speak about? On screen, virtually, which is subject to strict surveillance. So I hope that pandemic will go away as soon as possible, so that face-to-face communication between people can get revived. I really think so. I really hope that will be the case. By getting the information, I always speak about information gap. Information gap causes awareness gap. So at the different levels, leaders level, politicians level, and the levels of general people, at the different levels, it's always important to have a dialogue at every level to know about what your counterpart is thinking about and to know why they think that way. What is the ground that counterparty think that way? That point needs to be delved into and understood. If you can understand that, then it might be convincing Chinese people based on that kind of information and saying that. No, it's not the case. There is other information available that we have, which can be shared with you, then maybe that could lead to different way of thinking. That's why I say that conversation between people is so important directly. So I hope our pandemic will go away as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. You talked about social media. On the internet, there are news apps, and there are some recommended news to unique users, and people tend to get access to information they like, and the information which are highly rated by the user. The similar kind of information goes into the user. Therefore, we have to be careful about bias of information we get. However, whether we can get information or not, separate from information literacy problem aside, I think we have to have the environment where people can access any kind of information. In China, there are protests and demonstration and violence, and sexual assault cases as well. News on these cases are not readily available in China. In the case of Peng Shuai case, this was not fully reported domestically in China, and the international community is worried about this case. However, that worry is not explained in China as well. I don't exactly remember when that was. Several years ago, there was a hero on the bed, the kind of movement. The foreign people record the love affairs secretly, and they release the video on social media, and the counterpart of love affairs are the Chinese leaders. And this was caused a hanfai, and this was said to be the surveillance by the Chinese government of the Chinese people, and also people eating in restaurants. The video is posted on the social media, and also the politicians are wearing different watches every time, saying that they are receiving bribery and so forth. On the side of Me Too movement, it seems to me that movement is controlled and oppressed. And what is the Chinese Communist Party's intent with regard to such a social movement? By what criteria Chinese government, just like a hanfai movement source that is used, and also information disclosure movement is contained, and what is the criteria for making a different approaches for China?
Thank you. You had mentioned about the surveillance by people. The social media is watching the corruption, and the people are watching and surveying and reveal that. Me Too movement is also in that flow of events, placing more emphasis on women's rights. So it used to be a big issue, but international solidarity is what China is afraid of, like LGBT. For example, in Taiwan, same-sex marriage is being admitted, and it's being held with a high valuation internationally. But in China, LGBT groups, one after another, have been pressurized and cannot carry out activities anymore. And social media have been closed and shut down. Not only that, entertainment industry influencers have been the subject of attack by the authority as well. It's not in the politics realm, but those are the people who have an influence over general people. And they tend to work together with the rest of the people. So apart from the Communist Party, there are some people who have a big influence in Chinese society. And those influencers are gaining popularity. But that is unacceptable by the authority of China. So like Me Too movement as well, women got solidarity and linked to international movement. That is what the Chinese authorities are afraid of.
Thank you very much. We have received several questions from the viewers, so I would like to ask the speakers to respond to them. There are two questions. First of all, addressed to Professor Takahara. Professor Takahara earlier said that this kind of situation is expected to continue for some time to come. As long as the Xi Jinping administration is in place, or as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, the current situation will not be changed. The second question, Professor Takahara's earlier comment regarding that comment, there is a comment from the viewer. There are countries where people are arrested by speaking something unfavorable to the government. However, in other countries, there is democratic countries where information is readily available. How do we treat them?
Thank you. How would you take the length of a history? As you had rightly said, the current system under Xi Jinping, if it continues, then that will become very difficult. Do you think that period is too long or too short? It's a relative thing. It depends on the people that you are talking about. From the aspect of long history of China, then it would be like this for some time to come. If Mr. Xi would live long, then of course people feel that era under the rule of Xi is too long, so long, but what you say is true. And about your second point, as I said previously, I talked about information control. Of course, information control per se is a problem. Criticizing that because of the incidents happening, it's only natural that we criticize about the information control. However, we come from a free country. Don't we have any problem? We have to be careful about the information that circulates because, as you see in the United States, democracy per se might get hurt. That is a source of the seriousness of the issue, and we have to really think about that seriously.
Thank you very much. Professor Takahara's comment. In the opening remarks of the Summit for Democracy, the President Biden showed a sense of crisis regarding the decline of democracy in the world. Therefore, we have to rejuvenate democracy and strengthen democracy. There is a need for that. Therefore, we have to stand up. That was what President Biden said. So your comment is very related to that. Professor Ako, there is a question to you. Professor Ako, you are studying Chinese society, and this time also you focused on Peng Shuai case, and even before that, you studied the human rights lawyers cases, and also you have been working with them, you have been exchanging information with them, and so you have been closely watching the Chinese society. Toward the end of your remarks, you talked about the difficulty faced by human rights lawyers. That if the current situation is as you described, then Chinese social situation is such that you have to expose that, and the Chinese society, maybe this is the idea held by the Communist Party. The ideas of Communist Party, do you think they will change? If there is a possibility of changing their ideas, what kind of pressure or influence is necessary for that to happen?
Yes. How to change the basics of a CCP-led government, which is a very difficult thing. Human rights lawyers, there are so many of them, so it's hard to generalize who they are, what kind of people they are, but they are always looking for rule of law, saying that that is most important. Of course, they are lawyers. Even if you are with an influential leader of a CCP, under rule of law, everyone is equal. But look at the Peng Shuai's case. who used to be a member of the standing committee of the Politburo, there is no way that that kind of a high-level person will be punished as any other general people, because they are at the core of the leadership. So no way that they will go to court. There was a case of Bonji Ohara, but it's different. The people with power rarely go to the court. In case of anti-corruption or other serious cases, they will never go to court. Of course, people's democracy exists in China. That's what Chinese people say, but more bigger problem is the absence of a rule of law in China, because there is a single party there, and the Communist Party can always gain power. That is given in China. Under that kind of country, it's impossible to have a rule of law to take root. That's why human rights lawyers are having a difficulty inside China, how to change the situation. Of course, there are many kinds of democracies out there, but rule of law is very difficult, I would say.
Thank you very much. This is going to be the last question. There are supporters of President Trump, and they are watching Fox News, actually. However, they are not necessarily influenced by the media. Rather, there are such people in growing number, consumers of such news. That is the problem. Before we have the media, we had seen the divide in the society. So if that is the background, then, of course, social media-based reinforcement of such a situation is one thing. Even though that is the case, if the ideas behind what's happening now is so diverse and divided, so it's very difficult to overcome the divide in the United States, but not only in the US, but also within China, as Professor Ako said. For Chinese Communist Party, in order to maintain the government, it is highly crucial issue. Therefore, the government don't want to look into human rights issue. However, if that's the case, there is no way out, no way forward. However, in such a situation, human rights have to be defended in democratic countries too. Our freedom and the safe life have to be protected. And this is also true in the socialist and authoritarian countries as well, because this is a right given to everybody. However, it's difficult to change the situation. However, I want to give you 1 minute each before we conclude. In what way could we make a progress to change the society? First, Professor Ako.
Thank you. China, too, is placing the emphasis on the people's rights, because the socialist system places emphasis on the workers as well as women's rights. With regard to Peng Shuai's case, she raised her voice, which drew the attention, but people like to live like human beings. That's why people are becoming vocal. As long as human beings are there are certain kinds of thoughts that will persist. Environmental issues, climate change issues, those are the issues that countries can cooperate, and China is becoming proactive there. That's why you had mentioned there are so many differences there, and that there are big differences between us and China, but there are certain areas where we can cooperate and coordinate. But there are certain areas we cannot budge. So China has to do their job and has to change their behavior internationally and so forth. Japan should be more vocal about that against China.
Thank you. Professor Takahara, please.
As it was pointed out by chat, there is an intention behind the information transmitter, and also social base of the receiver side of the information are also becoming relevant. So talking about the current China, they are still in the process of raising their quality of life. living standard. So there are lots of people who would like to believe what the leadership are saying. But when it comes to women's rights, the half of the population is women. And the people would stand out to raise their voices for the rights of women. And the people who emphasize that kind of view is large. And that is a source of a threat for the CCP.
Thank you very much. So the solution is difficult, but even so, sorry for asking you even more difficult question to answer. In our conversation today, the information literacy is important. We have to get access to diverse information. That is important. Professor Takahara, Professor Ako today talked about the women issue in China, including sexual assault issues, situation regarding women, and also political ideas, political way of thinking was introduced by the speakers. We would like to continue to closely watch the situation in China and communicate the situation to the external audience. Thank you very much, Professor Takahara and Professor Ako. This concludes SPF China Observer public forum organized by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you very much for joining the program.